Good morning. We'll go ahead and begin here. So I'm Steve Tungate. I'm the director of the Center for Pastoral Formation here at Greenville University, and it's a partnership center with the Free Methodist Church. We work with the ordination processes and systems and some of our online courses for those who are studying for ordination and continuing education for pastors in the Free Methodist Church, and it is in partnership with Greenville, so our offices are here in the JKL building, and it's a privilege to be here and excited to share a bit about Mary LaDue and instrumentation in the Free Methodist Church. Just a couple connecting points. I'll make a couple more throughout here. But it's interesting, Lucas was talking about the founding of Elmira College, which was the women's college that began here in Greenville, and then as they closed, the Free Methodists bought the college and began Greenville College at that time. But just a little connection point. It's fun learning a little bit more about Elmira College because my wife Rachel is here and my oldest daughter Natalie is here. And we live right here on Main Street in a house that was around during that time. And supposedly some of the girls from Elmira College stayed in our attic. And if you saw the attic today, you would not want to stay there. And but even with the plastered walls, but no insulation, no fireplace, I don't know how they survived the winters up there. But it was fun learning and really enjoying these and enjoying this project in general. I'm going to begin with just give a real brief overview of Mary, and then we're going to go into chronologically. I'll try not to make it just going through a chronological year by year, try to insert some other things along there, but we're going to go chronologically looking at the development of instrumentation in the Free Methodist Church and the non-use of instruments in worship services, and then later bringing in the instruments into the Free Methodist Church and some lessons we can learn, and Mary's influence along the way in that. So just a brief couple paragraph summary of Mary. Mary LaDue served as a musician and professor of music at Greenville College for 38 years, divided among 3 stints, spanning from 1924 until her retirement in 1971. She was educated at the University of Illinois, where she received her Bachelor of Music degree in 1924 and Bachelor of Science degree in music in 1927. She later went on to earn a Master in Music Education degree from the University of Oklahoma in 1946. And after her years of faithful service at Greenville College, she was awarded an honorary doctorate of music in 1971. Throughout her career, she also engaged in other courses of study, non-degree study, but other courses of study at the University of Michigan and my alma mater, Michigan State University. Go White, thank you. And University of Iowa, University of Munich, Germany, and the University of Fontainebleau, France. So she is well-traveled, well-educated, and a continual learner. She served as a professor of music during a time of monumental transition in the Free Methodist Church regarding the use of instruments in churches. Since the denomination's founding, musical instruments were not allowed to be used in church buildings or worship services. This changed in 1943, as will be discussed in a moment, possibly in part due to Mary's influence. So let me give a breakdown looking at some of our background as Free Methodists and bringing in that progression of bringing in instruments into worship and alongside Mary's life, because the two kind of go along side by side. So 1848, the year that B.T. Roberts, the founder of the Free Methodist Church, began preaching. He began preaching in the Rushford district of the Genesee Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And that district in particular, in 1848, passed a resolution forbidding instruments and choirs in church. Now, this was not broadly throughout the Methodist Episcopal Church at that time, but it was for their district. Their district decided we don't want instruments or choirs in the church. Okay, that's 1848. Just for timeline and correlation here, 1855 was the year that Elmira College was founded. And actually, Lucas talked about the founding of Elmira College, and this is a beautiful story related to musical instruments. So Elmira Morris, the founder of Elmira College, had a personal piano that is now in the Bond County Museum. If you have gone through there, you can see her piano. It's over there. But Lucas told the story of how she brought that piano from New York, but there were no trains at that time. So she brought it paid to have it shipped here by boat around the south end of Florida, on up the Mississippi River, and then when it hit St. Louis, it was put on a stagecoach to be brought here to Greenville. So that little piano in the Bond County Museum has quite a story and has been well-traveled by sea and by river and by stagecoach. So the use of a piano has been something that even the founding of Elmira College, Elmira Morris had her personal piano. 1855, now back with B.T. Roberts here, the church at Brockport, which Roberts had served, had a choir and instruments. So the district he was in forbade those things, no choir, no instruments in worship services. And then later, the next church that he served actually had a choir and instruments. In 1856, so while he's there in Brockport, Roberts wrote a letter and an article lamenting the extravagance of musical performance in church. How would you like to be a part of his choir? So he was lamenting this. He felt that the choirs and instrumentation were too worldly and too performance-based. So he felt that congregational singing was the more authentic expression of worship. In 1860, we saw the founding of the Free Methodist Church, so just 5 years later after he is in Brockport. So he brought those convictions with him in the founding of the Free Methodist Church. So right off the bat, there are no instruments and no choirs allowed in the worship services, and no instruments in churches in general. 1892 is the founding of Greenville College after Elmira College had closed, and 1893 is when B.T. Roberts died, to put this all together in that early beginnings of Greenville College and B.T. Roberts' life. So Greenville College was founded during B.T. Roberts' life, right shortly before he had died. In 1893 to 1894, we actually have the old record books of the courses that were offered and giving who was teaching each course, beginning in 1893 in the archives. And in the earliest edition that we have, the 1893 to 1894 school year, Greenville College was offering their school. They had a school of music, and they were offering courses in harmony, sight singing, music history, voice, and ready for this? Piano and organ. So the college was offering courses in piano and organ at a time when they were not allowed in the sanctuary or in a church. So it wasn't that the piano and organ were totally forbidden, but just in the expression of worship to God is where they were forbidden, in those spaces. They even offered private lessons, and it sounds like the private lessons were broadly available for any student who wanted to participate, not just for the music education, or the School of Music students. These were for any could take private lessons or take some of these courses in piano and organ. So that's 1893, 1894. In 1894, also we see John and Jenny LaDue. This is Wilson's parents, so we're looking back at Mary LaDue's husband Wilson. His parents came and arrived in Greenville. John, so this is Mary's father-in-law. John came to Greenville College to found the theology department. Jenny LaDue was incredibly well-known and loved in Greenville on all accounts. These are the wording that was used in some of the descriptions about her. She was a known musician and provided spiritual guidance and support to students. In 1902 is when Mary's husband Wilson was born in Greenville. So now back to the Free Methodist Church. Here's a picture of John and Jenny LaDue with their children. So Wilson is there on the lap to the left. In 1907, there's clarification that the forbiddance of instruments in worship included their use in Sunday school. So apparently somebody may have been sneaking a piano into a Sunday school classroom, and they needed to do something about it. So we need to also be very clear that you are not allowed to use a piano in a Sunday school class either, not just the sanctuary, but no Sunday school either. So you can see how strong these convictions were against the instrumentation as an expression of worship in the sanctuary and in the church in general. In 1922, at the Greenville College Sophomore Frolic on Marston Lawn, the festivities included a piano duet. So they did actually use the piano in celebration things on college, again, just not in worship. So that was in the Wilson and Mary LaDue papers. We see some of those old flyers for the sophomore frolic and some of those other events. They kept those and preserved those. So it's great flipping through some of those and seeing what some of those festivities included. 1924, Wilson graduated from Greenville College. 1924, Mary also received her Bachelor of Music from the University of Illinois. And that began Mary's teaching career here at Greenville. So in 1924, as soon as she graduated from the Bachelor of Music at the University of Illinois, she began teaching here at Greenville College in the music department. And that was 1924 to 1926. So as I said in that beginning part, this was just she had 3 stints of teaching throughout her teaching career here at Greenville College. So this was the first one for just a couple years. In 1927, Mary received her Bachelor of Science in Music from the University of Illinois. And then in 1927, Wilson and Mary married. And it was fun looking through the archives. They preserved a lot of poems that they had exchanged back and forth. So they both wrote some beautiful poetry. Some of it, how would I explain it? Some of it felt a little over the top in the way they expressed it, but at the same time, there's this beautiful sharing of their love through poetry, and especially at times when they're traveling or away from each other, they exchange these poems back and forth. They also were known for their traditions. They had very strong traditions. So annually, this is one of their traditions that began when Wilson was a master's student at the University of Michigan. They were poor students, and so they couldn't afford a whole lot. So that first Christmas together, they bought a Jane Parker fruitcake, and that became an annual tradition for them after that. Their first Christmas together, they ate a Jane Parker fruitcake together. And then every year after that, they went to A&P to buy another Jane Parker fruitcake that they shared together. And we do not have any of those fruitcakes in the archives. However, the reputation of fruitcakes is they probably would have lasted, wouldn't they? The Friday after Thanksgiving, this is another tradition. This is when Christmas began. The Friday after Thanksgiving, they would turn on the radio and play carols in the morning and the Messiah at night every day until Christmas. And we're standing in a place that has had a long-standing tradition of the Messiah being performed. Does anyone know when that began here off the top of your heads? It's been a long-standing tradition. I don't know. But anyway, that was part of their tradition as well. And I mentioned the poetry. So that was 1927 that they got married. So remember, Mary taught here in 1924 to 1926. They got married in 27. And then from 1929 to 33 or 1932 to 36, it wasn't real clear in the records that we have. But Wilson went to teach at Spring Arbor College in Michigan during that time. So again, that kind of correlated with when he was a student at the University of Michigan, and then they're close. Spring Arbor's not that far from Ann Arbor, so he taught there for a little while. So this was part of their time away from Greenville. And I do have a picture of Wilson and Mary together here as well. So 1931, so right at this time, they're relatively newly married. Wilson's teaching. Mary had done a brief teaching stint, and then Wilson's teaching at Spring Arbor. 1931 is when the General Conference of the Free Methodist Church made a proposal to remove the forbiddance of instruments and choirs from the discipline. So in other words, somebody was bold enough to make the proposition that we no longer forbid choirs and instruments in worship. Okay? That proposal was voted against 98 to 45. So think of those numbers, 98 to 45. 98 people said, absolutely not, we are keeping choirs and instruments out. 45 said, hey, let's do it. Let's go for instruments and choirs. There was an exemption clause for, this was, I found interesting. There was an exemption clause in there for foreign-speaking churches or missions. This is a direct quote. Foreign-speaking churches or missions in the United States, Mexico, and Japan. So in other words, they allowed for that cultural variance, which I thought was beautiful, that even though those strong convictions were deeply held, they made allowances for other cultures to be able to express worship to God in a way that made sense to them. So there was that exemption clause. They could use instruments if they were a foreign-speaking church or mission in the United States, Mexico, or Japan. So 1931 through 35, there was some controversy that emerged. So during this quadrennium between the general conferences, the Board of Administration called for a referendum on the question of music, and votes were taken in the local membership of the denomination. In 1935, the General Conference declared the referendum unwise and unauthorized, and the results of the voting were never disclosed. So that was interesting. They actually took a vote between General Conferences, but the board deemed that was not in keeping with proper discipline. So this General Conference defeated the proposal to approve instrumental music by a vote of 43 for approval and 112 against. A definitely lower ratio from the instrument from that than the 1931. So this is the 1935 General Conference. The vote was 43 to 112. Okay. I'll bring up those numbers in a minute so we can have a visual to see that progression over time. 1933 through 1945, Mary is back teaching in Greenville College music department once again. So you can see there are times when Mary and Wilson had moved away for other things, for school, for teaching in other places, but they always came back to Greenville. Greenville was their anchor place. Greenville was the place that they kept coming back to. And sometime during that time, Wilson and Mary adopted Elmer and Eldred after their parents had died. Wilson received a doctorate from the University of Illinois in 1939. And then in 1939, that same year, General Conference vote to allow instruments by vote of local congregation was shot down by a vote of 98 to 61. So the gap is narrowing, and people are becoming more in favor of allowing for instruments to be used in worship. However, it was still defeated, still not allowed in 1939. Now, in 1939, Mary did something kind of interesting here. She actually played the organ for a wedding. So it was a wedding for Kenneth and Pauline Klein. And this was held in LaDue Chapel at the college so that they could have instruments. So instruments were allowed in the college chapel, but not in a church per se. So there may have been some little hair splitting on some of those laws. There's rules that they had. But she did play the organ for their wedding in the chapel, so they did honor what the Book of Discipline had said about not allowing the organs and pianos in the church setting. 1943, we see that the General Conference of the Free Methodist Church was actually held here in Greenville. So this was a pivotal moment for the idea of instruments in church. In 1943. So this debate has been going on now for a long time, since 1931, so we're looking at about a dozen years. This debate has been going on. It's been brought to General Conference. Can we please have choirs and instruments in the worship service? And some saying absolutely not. However, in 1943, we see it shift. The ninth sitting saw 2 hours of debate and questions, so 2 hours debating this, and questions about the process of discussion and decision regarding instruments. There's a quote from the Free Methodist, which was the publication magazine at that time that kept all the Free Methodists throughout the country updated on the happenings. And here's a quote. The conference frequently finds itself in parliamentary entanglements. So a kind way to say they were debating pretty intensely about this. We see also from the Free Methodist that regarding the 10th sitting, so it's still part of the same general conference, there is an air, this is a quote again, there's an air of expectancy and keen interest as to the momentous possibilities of the sitting, which bids fair to become an historic occasion. So they're seeing this as a very historic moment. And the vote was called, and the instruments passed 88 to 83. So now, 1943, they were allowed to have instruments. I will bring the numbers up. There's one last number at the bottom, 1947, I'll get to in a moment. But you can see how the gap narrowed. So the wording was different, so I have this in two columns, approving instruments and opposing instruments. So the way it was worded, the votes for and against could have been confusing. So I have those four instruments and those opposed. 1931, 45 to 98. 1935, 43 to 112. 1939, 61 to 98. You can see that progression getting closer and closer. Then 1943, the scales tipped 88 to 84. Very close vote to allow for instruments in the church based on conference approval and local congregational vote. So the conference had to approve. So you could be a part of a conference that would not approve musical instruments or choirs in the church, and in this case this was musical instruments, just musical instruments, not choirs per se. You could be a part of a conference that would not allow that, and so you wouldn't be able to have music in your church. If you were a part of a conference that did allow for that, then you needed that local congregational vote to approve it for your particular church, and it had to pass by 2/3 of a vote. It's interesting, I came across a record of the history of music in the Greenville Free Methodist Church in particular. And in there they said that once this vote happened, they actually did not approve instruments for the local church for this reason. It wasn't that they were opposed to having instruments in the congregation in worship services, but they voted against having instruments because they felt like they were a very good singing church. And the people could sing very well that they didn't need the instruments to accompany them. So I found that kind of interesting, the way they had viewed that at that time. 1945 to 47, so right on the heels of this, Wilson taught at Bethany Peniel College in Bethany, Oklahoma. But they maintained their home in Greenville. So once again they moved, this time to Oklahoma, but they kept their home here on North Elm Street in Greenville. 1946, during this break from their time here at Greenville, Mary received her Master in Music Education degree from the University of Oklahoma. So she was working on her degree while Wilson was teaching, and they were living in Oklahoma. 1947 to 1971, this was the longest stint, they're back here in Greenville. Mary teaching again, once again, in the music department. And it looks like at this point is when the students started to refer to them as Uncle Wilson and Aunt Mary. So you can see the affection that the students had for them, and they for their students. 1947 General Conference. So this is this bottom line here. There's a new vote, and this vote was to eliminate the conference approval. So this put it totally in the hands of the local church, that each local church could decide if they wanted to have instruments in the church. And this passed 91 to 72, so you can see how the gap got even bigger, those approving the instruments and those opposed, but putting the decision into the hands of the local congregation. This was a quote from some of the records of this time, of this general conference. Some great speeches are made. We hear about camels getting into tents, Free Methodist churches located next to bakeries, looking through telescopes from the wrong end. You may wonder how such things apply to the question of music, but great is the power of mental gymnastics. I love that. So people were debating to the point, we'd say like filibustering. You're just trying to fill the time, hoping to sway some people in one direction or another. 1950, Greenville Free Methodist Church then approved the use of instruments in November during the pastorate of Lyle Donnelly. They proceeded to install a Baldwin Electric at that time. So in 1950, the Greenville Free Methodist Church then approved the use of an organ in worship. 1955, the General Conference then finally allowed choirs to be a part of the worship service. Instruments were based on the majority vote at the local church still. So now it's both choir and instrument allowed if the local church, now by majority vote, not just 2/3 vote. Okay, so you can see that progression over time. In 1958 to 1960, Greenville Free Methodist Church services were held in the college chapel to make use of the pipe organ. So there's the first occurrence of some of the pipe organ being used for the Greenville Free Methodist Church. 1960, this building was built to house the Free Methodist Church, the Greenville Free Methodist Church, now we refer to as Whitlock Music Center. 1969, Wilson LaDue died, and Mary turned to gardening as a hobby to fill that time and to process through her grief. And to the point where she was actually interviewed by some local and St. Louis newspapers and started to get a reputation as a great gardener. So some of her hobbies there. Now 1970, so again, this building built 1960. 1970, Mary LaDue donated $20,000 toward an organ. The total cost was $35,000. It was a Wicks organ, the LaDue Memorial Organ, in memory of John, Jenny, and Wilson. Mary wrote to alumni, her nieces and nephews of Wilson, who are nieces and nephews of she and Wilson, who are part of the 6 classes which Mary and Wilson sponsored in order to raise the remaining funds. Don Bastian was a sophomore that year, and he actually planned a piano and French horn recital to help raise funds towards the organ. And there was also a concert that was performed by one of the musicians that traveled with Billy Graham. And unfortunately, the material I saw was kind of vague and didn't expand on that. And then yearly recitals were performed with that organ. And in 1971, Mary retired. She was given an honorary doctorate of music degree from Greenville College, and in 1982, she had passed away. And here's a picture of the organ, but you don't necessarily need the picture, just look over my shoulders, and there it is. So this is the organ that Mary LaDue was very instrumental, yes, pun intended, instrumental in bringing that about in Greenville here. So I want to look at, we're kind of running low on time here. Let me move on. A couple of great stories that I'd love to be able to share. This is one I will share. This was an email that was sent to Kierlyn Martin, forwarded to Brian forwarded it to me. But let me just read directly from it. I learned a funny story. This is from Jerry Smith. A funny story later about Mary LaDue. An uncle of Brad Klein told a story about when he was a student at Greenville. He claimed to have been mischievous all the time while there. One day, walking along the street in front of Hogue Hall, he saw Mary LaDue approaching him. He claimed he could see her face searching for something to say, since she was always so kind. As she met him, she called him by name and said, "You have such a nice walk." That was all she could come up with in the moment, but she had to say something nice. I love that story. So let's look at hearing the bells, bringing us to noon here. Here's our honorary Doctor of Music degree from Greenville College, a copy of that. And let's look at a few life lessons. Some lessons that we can learn regarding instrumental music in the church. I'd say use care to guard against legalism. There are some things that we bring in that we become maybe they're a deep conviction based on some good principles and good reasons, but later those convictions start to morph into a legalistic rule that we have to follow. We need to guard against legalism. And I love that Mary was bold enough to, even her playing the organ at a wedding, was somewhat of an act of defiance, but still within the realm, but she pushed against the boundaries in a way that was appropriate when there are boundaries that should be pushed against. Not all boundaries should be, let me be clear there. But when there are boundaries that should be pushed against, it is okay, and we should be able to do that. And Mary modeled that for us. A couple other lessons. Instruments are biblical. We see the Bible talking about harps and lyres and cymbals and tambourines and all sorts of things there. Now, another lesson, modes of styles may change, and in many ways they should change. When the heart is right, all styles of music may become sacred and bring glory to God. It's interesting looking historically at the debates over music. John Wesley, actually he went to the very first church performance of Handel's Messiah. Again, that's something performed every year here. And John Wesley was very against polyphonic music. If there are two melodies over the top of each other, Wesley did not like that. And he wrote about that in his journal, that he did not like polyphonic music. So there are debates over musical styles throughout history. Even John Wesley had his preferences in that. Since then, and Dr. Hartley talked about bringing drums into a church. There's a point at which, okay, pianos and organs are now accepted, but not drums. We have to draw the line there. So bringing drums into the church and getting a lot of opposition towards that. And then as drums were allowed, then it was a debate where do you put the emphasis of the beat? If you have 4/4 time and you do a 1/3 beat, that's okay. But if you go 2/4, I'm sorry, that's not okay. So bum, 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 that's okay, but bum, 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 that's not okay. We have to draw a line there. So these are part of the debates over music, which sounds silly to us sometimes, but the debates were very real. Hymns versus choruses. The debates continue. Maybe one other lesson I'd say in there. There are times when I think back in my own relationship with God and the music that formed me when I was starting to get serious about my relationship with God. And there are songs that still today, when I hear them, they just take me right back to that sense of calling that God was placing on my life, that the fresh experience of God that I hadn't had before. And those songs still take me back. I think it's easy for us to look back and say, if only the music was like that back then. That's when I found meaning in music, not so much this other stuff today. That's been something that's gone on throughout history. But the music changes, the styles change. But if the heart is right, it should all bring glory and honor to our God, shouldn't it? Now, some brief lessons about Mary, just to take home. She was a lifelong learner, as should we be. She loved to travel and experience life. She was always ready with a kind word, even if the kind word was only, "You have a nice walk." She pushed the boundaries when appropriate. And finally, one gap that I was hoping to find in here, in the minutes for the general conference, I was hoping to find that gap that showed that one of her students was the one who proposed the resolution to general conference to make the change. I couldn't find those connections. I was hoping to find that. I couldn't find that. But as I reflect on this, I got thinking that even though those connections weren't there, or I couldn't find them necessarily, given the number of students that she instructed over the years, I imagine that many of the individual votes that swayed toward the allowance of instruments likely included some of her former students. That's very likely, with the influence of Greenville College in the Free Methodist Church. Not to mention those who went on to be church pianists and organists. Actually, in that email from Jerry, he actually talked about his sister being a pianist in her church even today, and from some of that influence. But isn't that what legacy is all about? Our influence isn't always directly measurable. It often remains subtle, quiet, and undetectable, until we look back and see how profoundly an individual who humbly and obediently serves can be used by God. What will your legacy be? I'll defer to Brian a bit. I don't know if we have time for any further discussion. Are we okay with about 5-10 minutes? Okay, so if there are any questions, comments, who of you knew Mary personally? Okay, a few of you here. So even if one or two of you want to share just a real brief, please do keep it brief so we have time for others to share or question. If you want to share any kind of story, please do. That's great. Thank you. Yes. I'm sorry, could you say that again? Okay. Okay, Mary and Wilson took rides together every evening for their time together. Yes. Yes. Yes, yeah, it sounds like some influence on the clothing allowances as well. Mm. Oh, wow. Okay, great lessons in hospitality then as well, and exposure to broader musical styles. That's great.
My guess is what Dale just described about the hospitality in the household was carried over from the generation before. Because we have clear stories of John and Jenny LaDue making their house available for students. And Jenny was known as a great hostess. So my guess is their sons and others picking up what you were learning from their certain parents.
Ah, yes, yeah. Should I tell the story of our table? And I think that hospitality continues on. Those of you who know the Amundsons, we bought the Amundsons house. And as we were touring, there's a large dining room, and our dining room table is small. And I kind of jokingly said to our realtor, well, if they want to leave this large dining room table, we'd be okay with that. She actually took that back to the Amundsons, and they said they had a history of their time here in Greenville of hosting students around their dining room table, and they'd have their students sign the bottom of the table. So they said if they keep that tradition going, we'll leave the table for them. So we have. So that hospitality around Greenville is carrying on today, and we hope to carry that on as well.
Do you have any idea how many times they were elected class sponsors?
That's a good question. I'm trying to go off the top of my head. I think I remember seeing there were 4 years for sure during one of the stints, but I'm not sure beyond that if it was multiple times.
I'm pretty sure they have a record.
Did they? Okay, yeah.
It seemed to be the case that at time to select the class sponsors, you first had to see Mary and Wilson were available.
That's great.
They had a class, then we selected somebody else. Otherwise, they went right back in finishing with some other class.
That's great. That says a lot about them too and their reputation among the students. Yeah. Uncle Wilson and Aunt Mary. I love that. All right. Well, I believe we are at the end of time. Brian, do you have any further instructions? Are we concluding?
Lots of food. No need to go somewhere and get lunch. Lots of food in the conference room behind the Sacred Chapel. And if you don't like the pastries and the muffins and all of those things, there's quite a bit of fruit in there as well. So please get some food. We're going to take what's left over to the alumni house afterwards. But don't bother going to find lunch anywhere. Please take the day home today.
And, okay, and I did just real quickly want to also say that with the grant, there is some faculty working with students as well. So I did have a student worker. My daughter Natalie started out helping get the ball rolling, so I drew from a lot of her early archival work. She ended up going to university in England and doing some archival work in Canterbury from here. So she wasn't as available to be here throughout the duration of the project to be able to present, but she helped get the ball rolling on this study of Mary LaDue. So I appreciate Natalie's work in this as well. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. God bless you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.